Joining us now for a practical look for solutions to solve South Africa's high rate of unemployment, especially among the youth, Cosatu spokesperson Sizwe Pamla, who's here in Johannesburg, the national coordinator at Fight Inequality Alliance South Africa, Wafaa Abdurahman, and in Cape Town, and we also have Ayanda, Kota of the Assembly of the Unemployed at Makhanda in the Eastern Cape. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us here on In Focus. Sizwe, let's start with you. When you look at the numbers, by all indication, between Q4 and Q1, the number of employed persons increased by 370,000. The number of unemployed persons decreased by 60,000. What does it mean? What did we do? Is it just by pure chance? Is it something that we did deliberately? And is it something that we can replicate and do more of?
Well, there isn't much that we have done. Firstly, if you look at the numbers closely, you realize that the biggest employer was government. Many of those jobs are temporary. It's the temporary employment that government has been embarked upon, has been doing at a municipal level, for an example. None of those jobs are actually permanent, because since 2014, the TPSA, National Treasury, imposed a moratorium on filling funded vacancies in the public service. That's number one. Number two, if you remember, in the first quarter, we removed all of the restrictions. We moved to level 1. So quite a number of restrictions were removed. As a result, many of the people who had been sitting at home because of restrictions in many sectors like tourism, entertainment, for example, they were allowed to go back to work. And as a result, I think subsequent to that, the government invoked the disaster management. What you are witnessing in some instances, our workers who were at home just going back to work, they are lucky enough to still find their jobs. So these, to a certain extent, are misleading figures. There isn't much that changed. And even if we were to say, actually, there were new jobs that were created, the numbers are just scandalous. I mean, there's almost half of the adult working population sitting at home with no ways of feeding their families. So, yeah, the numbers are misleading, but not impressive.
Yeah. Ayanda, are we missing something here? Are we missing a point about South Africa's joblessness crisis?
The numbers are not inspiring. I concur. They are not encouraging. During the COVID-19 disaster management, we lost over 3 million jobs. So, in terms of the real figures, over 13 million people remain in the street. They remain unemployed. They remain a waste. 49 million people that are employed. So, and of that, 15 to 24 young people, 15 years to 24 years, and 63.9% of that are unemployed. 25 years to 35 years, 42% of that remain unemployed. So it's a drop in an ocean. It's really not inspiring. It's really not encouraging at all. It's a drop in an ocean. We've got to do more than that.
Yeah, and I suppose that becomes the question then, Wafaa. What do we do? What do we do better for us to begin to deal with the jobs crisis? Sizwe pointing out, for example, the fact that things like the presidential employment stimulus is one of the things that created the kind of jobs that we are seeing, at least in these particular numbers, which is something that is not permanent. There are some who've been calling for those programs to be thought of more as permanent programs, and maybe even more such programs needed in order to balance the spend on social grants and actually getting people employed. What would you say to that kind of suggestion?
To tell you honestly, and I agree with Sizwe, a lot of the jobs that were created by government, for example, the EPWP, the public works programs, etc., it's short-term jobs. It's jobs that are rotational. So I may have a job now for a few months and I may not have a job again. The other thing for me is who they count as the employed. So people, when they go and do the census and people are selling sweets on the street for an hour or so and they are counted at that time, they're seen as employed. So for me, these figures are actually ludicrous because in the communities that we are working at, these figures are much higher than what is portrayed in statistics figures. So for me, creating an employment it's not a big deal. If the government has a political and moral will to do it. And for me, the first thing is, when I looked at where they were cutting, for example, the construction industry, a lot of people are homeless. There's no houses being built for the poor in South Africa. So it just shows that the economy is not based on the needs of the South African poor masses. It's based on profit before people. So for me, for example, if government sets up an agency where houses can be built, for the masses, it could solve two problems. For example, the issue of homelessness, the dignity of living in a decent home, that could lead to the ANC's whole program called A Better Life for All, right? And the second thing, it could create jobs amongst the youth. The other issue for me that was ludicrous is that in the agricultural sector, jobs are lost. And during COVID pandemic, it was shown up to us that food security was a major issue and still remains a major issue for the masses. So why is it that the agricultural sector is losing jobs? That sector should be going up. I mean, we should make land available to small-scale farmers and specifically black farmers, and not just make land available, but government should play a major role in that, that it finances those small-scale farmers, it provides implements, it provides knowledge and skills, so that we could have cheaper food production for subsistence living, but at the same time for market purposes. There's issues of the environment, climate, jobs. We are currently seeing weather patterns that are fluctuating. I know in Joburg it's very cold. In Cape Town it's extremely cold as well. And this tells us that there is a need for renewable energy. And how do we look at a just transition, for example, without giving other alternatives to workers that are working in the extractive industry? How do we start giving skills and so on? So there's so many things. And the last thing that I would like to say is the issue of unpaid care work for women, for example. These are women that are keeping up our communities at the coalface. Their work is going unnoticed, unpaid for. I'm saying the social net should be broadened by government. And as Fighting Inequality Alliance, for example, we are saying you should tax the rich. You should have that will to tax the rich so that the rich can pay, so that the poor can live. Because at the moment, corporate taxes are cut and everything else in between is cut. But the poor pays for the debt that the state makes. The poor pays for all the things, for austerity measures in terms of their budget cuts. So they need to have a will. And I think Comrade Ayanda most probably can speak much more on the basic income grant that needs to be given to the poor as well.
And Sizwe, let's talk a little bit more about what Wafaa is raising there. For example, we say we've got some kind of strategy of recovery, and the point of that strategy is to focus on infrastructure, building roads, building all sort of infrastructure that we currently need. Yet we are seeing a drop in the construction sector by 5.3%. That certainly means we are talking something and we're doing something else. Maybe there could be an argument around, of course, the geopolitical situation. When we speak about agriculture, I would tell you that because, for example, the price of fuel goes up, the price of farming becomes a little bit more expensive, and therefore they farm less hectareage. Naturally, if you're farming less hectareage, you're going to hire less people. But is there a disconnect between what we are saying as far as policy direction and what we're implementing on the ground?
Well, yes, to a certain extent there is, but also there's a lot of honesty. For an example, let's look at what the president said when he first took over. I think he said, I'm going to be looking for investment to the tune of 1 trillion rand into South Africa around the world. He actually, I think, appointed 6 people as envoys to go around looking for that investment. A couple of months ago, I think he had an investment summit where he said, I'm 350 billion short of my target, and I'm halfway through the term. He was very excited. If you scrutinize that investment closely, some of that investment actually is destroying jobs. Let me take an example. In one of the sonars, I think 2 years or 3 years ago, I don't remember, in one of the State of the Nation addresses that he delivered, he said Ford in Pretoria was going to invest 15 billion on infrastructure in their Ford plant in Pretoria. Very excited. When we scrutinized that investment, we discovered that the CEO of Ford was called, CEO of Ford South Africa was called back into the US to ask him, why is it that you are lagging behind when it comes to automation and mechanization of the Ford plant in South Africa? What does that mean? It means replacing workers with machines. So he told us that there's a 15 billion investment coming into a Ford plant, yet failed to actually clarify that that investment is here to bring machines to replace workers in that Ford plant instead of creating new jobs. So that is the kind of investment that we get. This idea that foreign investment is the panacea to all of our social ills and economic problems is a mistake. That's number one. Number two, we have been talking about a developmental state, yet we are trying to build a developmental state on the foundations of a neoliberal macroeconomic framework. It's a farce. It can never happen. It has never happened anywhere else in the world. Number three, you can't say private sector creates jobs. When you gave the people of South Africa a manifesto that said you are going to create jobs, there's no manifesto of the ANC that said the private sector will create jobs under our leadership. The manifesto said we will create employment for the unemployed. And then you turn around and say, no, government doesn't create jobs. Actually, government creates jobs. The jobs that we have under apartheid, the Job Preservation Act that people are talking about, is because government was deliberately creating employment for white people. The kind of system that we have is not an accident. It was designed to be like this. Black people were never accommodated by the system that was designed. Now, we need to use the levers of the state to undo the system we inherited and make sure that the state uses the same levers of the state to create employment. But now we're being told that the private sector creates jobs. Yeah. Let's go back to 2012.
So are you saying private sector-led growth is a complete fallacy? It's something that will never happen?
It's a myth. It's been recycled for so long. It's even a joke. Even the IMF, funny enough, last year, IMF, for the first time, said to governments, you need to spend more than you are spending as governments. Yeah. IMF had never encouraged government spending. Yeah. Last year in January, IMF encouraged all government and said, no, you need to spend more money if you want to kickstart your economies after COVID-19.
But government has kept us crawling, man, at a growth rate that's way below 2%. And they've reached the ceiling. I don't know if there's more they can do.
No. In fact, let's go back to before 2009 global crisis, when the economy was growing in South Africa. We actually did have an economic growth, I think, between 2005 and 2007. That economic growth, it was never really about policy choices. There were three things that drove that economic growth. Number one, commodity prices. China was growing at 2 digits. It was consuming so many of our commodities that in terms of our exports, we were very competitive because from platinum to gold to everything else, China was buying all of it. Number two, high debt levels. People were taking so much debt from credit cards to borrowing money to buy houses at the time. Number three, it was infrastructure rollout in preparation for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. So even that economic growth, it was never based on the solid foundations of a sustainable economic framework. After 2010, with the economic crisis globally, Chinese economy started to go down. We had spent $1 trillion on infrastructure for Soccer World Cup. Some people who had taken money on credit now were meant to service the credit, that debt. So we have never had any macroeconomic framework that is sustainable, that is meant to create sustainable jobs in this country. Because you cannot rely on commodity prices as we are currently doing. Now, have we sat down and discussed this? Of course we have.
Yeah.
Look at the new growth party.
Let's talk about that when we come back from the break. What have you discussed when you sat down and raised these issues? Sizwe, Pamla, Wafaa Abdurahman, as well as Ayanda, Kota, staying with us as we continue to interrogate and get a better understanding of the key indicators in the labor market. Back with you tonight as we discuss the unemployment and employment numbers that came out from Statistics South Africa. Cosatu, Sizwe, Pamla, still with us. So we also have Wafaa Abdurahman, as well as Ayanda, Kota, of the Assembly of the Unemployed at Makhanda in the Eastern Cape. And let me come to you. We're going to have to make big moves. This is what experts keep telling us. But part of what the big moves are is that we need to institute much needed reforms. Part of those reforms meaning let's ramp up, for example, electricity generation. Give Eskom all the resources that it needs and the leeway to fight corruption, theft and vandalism. Recruit the critical skills that we need there at Eskom. Go after non-payers and do a little bit better there. Do you think that could be a solution that could help us?
Well, I want to concur firstly with Comrade Sizwe that FDI is a false solution. We've got to do a lot in terms of public investment because the current neoliberal policy of austerity, it only helps that it perpetuates unemployment. It bleeds unemployment. And one of the issues that have been raised here is a question of we are losing jobs in construction. We are losing jobs in agriculture. And the reality of the matter, if you meet about 1 in 4 South Africans go to bed on a hungry stomach. Hunger in this country, it's a huge thing. We have seen in Durban during the unrest riots how people went into the shops, and majority of those people were trying to help themselves in terms of food. So that speaks to also the question of hunger in this country. That also speaks to the question of unemployment as a time bomb. How we have seen young people who are participating in the unrest. That's one. I want to concur with the comrade. Number two, what that I want to bring also on board is the question of what Comrade Wafaa mentioned, the issue of basic income grant. That the government ought to be very committed and serious about the BIG, the basic income grant. I will tell you, during apartheid era, the corporate tax was around 40%. As we speak, because of precisely FDI, the corporate tax is around 27%. Despite that, the bosses continue to shift profit and also to cut on wages. I mean, capital flight. So you've got to tax the rich. You've got to tax the wealth in terms of funding the BIG, the basic income grant. As I'm saying, I mean, the issue of the Durban or KZN unrest was supposed to serve as a warning to many of us. And the unrest will continue in this country. As also we have seen in other parts like Joburg, this operation Dudula, some people blaming our foreign nationals that they are taking our jobs. Therefore, we need our jobs back. Therefore, they've got to leave. So if you look at the sources of problems in this country, including the domestic violence, and the source of this problem is unemployment. So you will never have stability as long as majority of the people, as I've said, just over 45%, 45.5% of the population is unemployed in terms of your expanded definition.
Yeah.
Because 34.5% is a narrow definition.
All right.
So those are some of the reforms. The basic income grant, the right to work have got to be enshrined in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Comrade Wafaa mentioned the climate jobs that you have just mentioned as well.
Yeah.
That we've got to move to just transition, and there you can create over 1 million jobs.
Now, if you look at Eastern Cape in particular, I mean, unemployment, they're sitting well at over 50% if you take the expanded definition. do we have workable solutions, right, to address the unemployment rate in rural parts of South Africa? Because if you look where the unemployment is the highest, it's in the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, as well as KwaZulu-Natal, sitting way over the 50% rate.
You've got workable solution. People refer to our province, the Eastern Cape, as a crime scene. Corruption is very rife in this province. Politicians are just plundering and stealing. That you've got to address. That's number one. Number two, the point that Comrade Wafaa mentioned, you've got to support the small-scale farmers. You've got to give them implements. You've got to support them, that they are able to produce food. You can't leave the lives of our people to these big white commercial farmers. That is another workable solution that the government ought to be quite serious about. I mean, these are low-hanging fruits. In government's land reform programs, the issue of supporting the small-scale farmers. So those are some of the solutions for our province, because it's a disaster. If you are talking about 45.5% of the unemployment in this country, you know half of that is the Eastern Cape. It is a disaster. It's a leaderless province.
What are the bases of which, Wafaa, we can, from the side of Fight Inequality Alliance, justify why we would need to take more debt, right? Because governments around the world are facing this risk of uncertainty, particularly around the question of debt, and particularly emerging countries are facing a huge debt crisis. But there are some who are saying, no, this government would need to borrow more if there's not enough in the kitty, because, of course, the base of those who are being taxed is forever decreasing, with more and more people becoming unemployed. What would be the basis that would justify us drawing more debt?
You see, the funny part for me is during COVID, while people were losing jobs, people were retrenched, we were told to stay at home and so on, the billionaires doubled their profits. And statistics that came out of Oxfam now recently says that every 300 days we turn over another billionaire. So for me, you know what, why are countries in debt? And the monies that these billionaires are making is off the backs of workers, you know, and that very same workers, their families are starving. How do you justify that? And then our governments are quick to run to the IMF and the World Bank to put us in debt. And then when it comes to the time of our budget, austerity measures and cuts are against the poor. So at the end of the day, while we go and make more debt and further debt and put ourselves into further debt, who pays for it at the end of the day? It's the workers, it's the poor. I mean, if I look now at the public sector, there's a freeze on wage increases. They are wanting to cut jobs, you know, and specifically in the health sector. And COVID showed us that during the time of COVID, basically, the health sector was an important sector. And still now, there's so many diseases, there's HIV, AIDS, there's all kinds of stuff, and we're still wanting to cut, you know, where poor people are going. So for me, going to make additional debt and not looking internally at where we can recover the money from, for me, that's short-sighted, because at the end, we are paying for that debt. So, if I look at the Ruperts, the Oppenheimers, and all of these billionaires located in our country, firstly, how they got their land, how they made their millions, was not because they got it and they worked hard for it. It was taken from us, you know, and they continued becoming rich off the back of the poor. And we tend to look outside, and we want to give them a free pass. What also happens is that industry is given the right of these export trading zones, and they are able to just do what they want. They're able to relax labor laws, etc., etc. And at the end, the workers suffer. For example, the Clover strike has been going on for how many months now, right? On the basis that this Israeli company came and bought Clover, in that they were going to create extra jobs. What is happening now? They're closing plants. They want to lay off workers. Workers must take half a cut in their salary, etc. Are the bosses doing that? No. Their salaries are increasing. They're getting billions and billions at the end of the day. So I'm saying instead of looking at the World Bank and the IMF and plunging us further into debt, look internally, because we can recover that money.
Yeah. Sizwe, what's the conversation then behind closed doors with your alliance partners? There are those who are saying that you are advising government wrong, for example, around the question of localization, saying this protectionist posture is certainly part of the reasons why this economy is not growing. How do you respond to that?
Well, just before I respond to that, I like the points that Comrade Wafaa was making. That there is actually no need for us to be going around seeking us deeper and deeper into there. Let's look at the money that has been given to the private sector since 2012, when the corporate tax was sitting at 34%. Unemployment at the time was 25%. Today, as the comrade rightly pointed out, it's sitting at 27% corporate tax. Unemployment, just narrow definition, has moved from 25 to 34. Real unemployment is 45%. And we were told that by giving money back to the private sector, we are going to create jobs and reduce unemployment. It's almost doubled unemployment. What does it tell you? There's a corporate welfare state that has been run over the last decade. Money going into the pockets of the private sector and workers losing their jobs. So when people say that we are in debt, no, you have taken the money that government used to collect, handed it over to the private sector with no conditions, with nothing in return. State security agencies told us in Parliament, 80 billion is taken out of this country because we removed capital controls in the early 90s. This country is like a casino. You win, you take your winnings. You have no obligations. You don't have to do anything in return. So that's a very good point, this issue that we are being pushed towards a debt. When money is being taken out of the fiscus, handed over to the private sector with no condition, and what do they do with it? They take it out of the country to tax havens. They hoard it. The Reserve Bank told us that they are sitting on 1.4 trillion at some point. So, yes, that's a very good point, that we actually don't have to borrow money. If we were taxing the corporations the way we're supposed to, we will have money. The reason is this government is running a corporate welfare state where the corporations in this country are on welfare, and yet they don't want to compete with people who are unemployed, who are asking for a basic income grant. Now, on the question you were raising, you were asking me about protectionism. Well, firstly, you actually run your country based on the challenges that face you. You don't imagine and live in a fantasy land. You are the most unequal country in the world. You have to act in the best interest of your own workers and your own members. There is not a single country in the world that is not looking after its own. If you want to create jobs, you need to be productive. South Africa consumes, but we produce nothing. Why is it that we're not producing? Because our people who want to produce cannot compete with cheap goods from China or Asia. This country is a huge warehouse of Asian goods. It's not an economy. For you to be an economy, you need to produce something, to be productive. All we ever do is to consume. Look at our financial sector, for an example. They are likely to give you $500,000 for you to buy a car. Ask for that $500,000 for you to produce, start a business. They are going to put so many hoops for you to jump over that you will be frustrated. Why? Because their lending has got the orientation that is consumptive in nature, consumptive lending. So what we need is to first acknowledge that as a country we are not producing anything. We are not going to create jobs when we are not producing anything. We can't continue to be consumers of goods we do not produce. It means we are actually subsidizing jobs in China, Vietnam, and any other Asian nation that is productive. So protectionism, to a certain extent, makes sense. You can even look at the WTO rules. They are flexible enough to acknowledge that in some areas, governments have the right to actually take steps, as long as those steps do not violate WTO rules, to actually protect some of the jobs or some of the sectors where they believe that their local economies will be affected.
The conversation continues then, particularly now. Let's turn our focus, Ayanda, to the question of the skills mismatch in the labor market. Statistics South Africa saying this is something that is still continuing. And is that something that is real, that you find is true, and are we doing enough to address it?
I problematize the argument of skills when it comes to the discussion of unemployment. My problem with that argument, it serves to use skills as a panacea to the problems of unemployment, which is not correct. That's number one. But number two, I am not in denial of that. That we need to do something about the education system of this country. It is in crisis. I'll make an example. If you've got about 10,000 people who start standard A or grade 1, when they reach 12, you've got 12,000 that register for grade 1, but when they reach 12, it's no longer 12,000, it's about 3,000. And no one accounts for the number of kids that have fallen by the side of the road to see what actually happened to them. So the issue of education crisis is also another problem in this country. So yes, I take that, but I also problematize it. Yeah. But another point that I would want to mention is the fact that we need permanent jobs in this country. Not these tantalizing jobs. You get a job for 3 months, you are counted as employed, then after 2 months you are unemployed again. So it's just tantalizing. It doesn't solve the problem of unemployment. That's number one. But number two, the emphasis that Comrade Sizwe and Comrade Wafaa have been making, the issue of public jobs, the issue of public investment, the issue of government coming to the show, the issue of government demonstrating or showing commitment as compared to the FDI, etc. Number three, the point that comrades have made again, the issue of reinvestment into the economy as against the tax havens, as against the profit shifting, as against cutting the wages. So I want to make an emphasis on those points, that the government has to show commitment on those points. Lastly, BIG, the basic income grant, we have spoken about it, we have given explanation that you've got to tax the wealth. I mean, there's a lot of money in this country. There's a lot of money that is taken out of this country. The issue of climate jobs, that there's if you move to just transition, because the issue of climate crisis is another time bomb in this country. It's a human threat. So climate jobs and also the right to work to be enshrined in the Constitution. You can have all the rights in the Constitution, but if you don't have, all other rights become meaningless if there is no right to work. You can have the right to life. You can have the right to dignity. But if you're unemployed, you don't have dignity. If you're unemployed, it's like you don't have the right to life. So the right to work, it's a fundamental right that must be enshrined to the Constitution of this country. We have been calling that since time immemorial, and we continue to call for the right to work to be enshrined in the Constitution of this country as part of that constitutional democracy.
All right, Ayanda. So let's comment on that as well. I mean, the question of failing to develop critical skills. Two, we put inhibition on bringing in required skills. We put something like maybe affirmative action or something like B and so on and so forth, saying that that's part of the challenges that this economy is facing. We are unable to bring the required skills for the type of economy that we need to create.
Firstly, we need to be careful of recycling this information that is being fed to us. For an example, take telecom. People say, oh, telecom was a state-owned entity, was privatized, became more efficient. They forget to tell you that telecom engineers were fired, qualified engineers, replaced by Chinese engineers. Telecom went on to outsource some of its functions to Huawei, Chinese company. The only reason was profit maximization. Are those engineers of poor quality, the telecom engineers? Of course not. They built the institution. They were let go because to make more money, they found engineers from China who could do that for less. So when you look at unemployed people, not all of them are actually poorly skilled. There's a lot of outsourcing where we go outside of the country, we look for skills, not because we don't have, but because we can pay less. So that is another argument. Number two, economies of our size when it comes to employment creation. 30% of workers are people who work for themselves. People who are artisans, people who build houses, fix cars, electricians, plumbers, all sorts of skilled and qualified people. They can work for themselves. They have skills, they are qualified. Why is it that in South Africa we only have 10%? On average, many countries is 30%. The issues you pointed out, you call the lower hanging fruits. Fix electricity. People can't work for themselves when you don't have a reliable electricity, when they pay more for electricity. Fix the issue of access to funding. For these people to work for themselves, they need to have access to affordable funding. Have a state financial institution where they can go and borrow money for productive purposes. Because when they go to a commercial bank is interested in giving money for consumption purposes.
Yeah.
Fix the price of fuel. Fix data cost to promote startups. As the comrade Wafaa had said, when you are giving people land, make sure that land bank is adequately resourced to support those farmers once they have got access to land. Let NYNDA be given enough resources to help young people who want to start their own businesses. Go to any township in rural areas. Young people are actually trying. They are starting these businesses, but they have to deal with electricity cost because of load shedding. They have to deal with the cost of fuel. They have to deal with the cost of data. They have to deal with all of these problems. So these are low-hanging fruits. At least put those fundamentals in place and then see young people taking charge of their own fate.
Wafaa, let's give you the last couple of minutes then that's left. The question of removing red tape is another one that has been raised. Are we going about this the right way? There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape that is being put. I mean, Sizwe is already raising some of it, particularly around raising finance to start a business, but even something as being able to get a hold of those billions that are being spent by government in procurement.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think anything access for the poor on all these fronts are always riddled with lots of red tape. But I just want to concur with both comrades. For example, the first thing I would say is to revisit and turn around our education system. I work with a lot of youth, and what I find is that our schooling system is not preparing our youth for the world of work, or even for the world outside. People are being boxed into that they have to go and study after they finish matric. A lot of our people don't have access to even complete their schools. A lot of them don't have access to the means to go and study further, and some of them just don't want to go and study further. So there's no alternatives created for our youth, in actual fact, to go into what we call the apprenticeships and so on. So for me, when I look at this, and I'm saying where we can cut the red tape, our communities, our service delivery is appalling at the moment. I mean, I went to a few rural areas at the moment, in a couple of months. We have potholes as big as dams, you know, in our communities. Why do we not create apprenticeships where youth can then take the responsibility to kind of bring dignity back to the places that they live? That they can be trained as plumbers, they can be trained as electricians, they can be trained within the construction industry where they can build homes, you know, in their communities, so that jobs are closely linked to where we live, as opposed to the spatial economic development of industries being very far away from people. We have to, as workers, we have to spend, we earn meager salaries, but we have to spend a lot of money on transport just getting to work. So why not bring the work closer to where we live and cut the time? I mean, cut the red tape. Let our communities be in charge of our communities and create jobs where we live.